Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Miami Beach Urban Studios live art talk with Will Gabaldon. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Colette Mello, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the City of Miami Beach Department of Tourism and Office of Cultural Affairs for sponsoring these art talks and for their continued support. Will Gabaldon is a Chicago-based painter and art educator. He was born and raised in New Mexico. Before moving to Chicago, Will lived in New York, where he founded the TSA New York Artist-Run Gallery. His work was just exhibited here in Miami during Miami Art Week at the NADA Art Fair. And now Will's paintings are on view at the V.F.A Gallery in Los Angeles, I believe until March 19th. Mm-hmm. Will received his B.F.A from the University of New Mexico and his M.F.A from the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you for joining us, Will. I'm going to hand over it to you now.
Okay, thanks, Colette. Yeah, and thanks for having me. This is really great. Let me share my screen real quick, or wait. All right, is this working?
Yep, we see it.
Screen. Okay, so I'm doing this talk. It's called On Painting. Basically, I'll talk about my own work at the end of this slideshow, but I really want to talk about other painters that that I really enjoy and have influenced me in different ways. And I want to talk kind of specifically about, how I look at painting, how I think about painting, and most importantly, like sort of how I use painting. So how I use other people's paintings in my own work. Because I think that's really important. I think a lot of the time, especially for students, they're taught to look at other painters, but sometimes maybe they don't really know like what they should be looking at or what they should be taking from other painters. So I just want to talk about my own process and like how I approach that. I wanted to start with these couple of quotes by Willem de Kooning. So the first one says, "There's no use worrying about being related to something it is impossible not to be related to. Whatever an artist's personal feelings are, as soon as an artist fills a certain area on the canvas or circumscribes it, he becomes historical. He acts from or upon other artists." And then, "I have no message. My paintings come from other paintings. This is my pleasure of living, of discovering what I enjoy in painting." So these two quotes by de Kooning, I mean, de Kooning is just fantastic talking about painting in particular, but art in general. And, I've read so many of his interviews, his writings on painting, and these two quotes really like stuck out to me. The first one, not worrying about being related to something, is really important because there's not really such a thing as like originality in art, I believe. Everybody comes from somewhere, and whether you know where you come from or not, like once you paint something or make some sort of art and put it out into the world, you could you could be related to somebody that you've never even seen before. Which is fine, but when somebody makes that comparison, I think sometimes people tend to they want to be seen as like completely original, and that's just impossible most of the time. The other quote, "I have no message. My paintings come from other paintings. This is my pleasure of living, of discovering what I enjoy in paintings." That quote really hit me hard the first time I read it, because that's pretty much how I feel. My paintings are really based in the world of painting of other painters' work. and it's really related to that world of painting. It's, sometimes, and you'll see in the slides that I'm presenting, sometimes there will just be something in someone else's painting that really inspires me to do something or want to try something. And I think that's really important. I think a lot of the time, especially with students, like they think that like artwork has to, I don't know, generate somehow out of like just their own experiences or like things that they're seeing in their lives. And I find most of the time like my art comes from other art. So here's my first image, which is a de Kooning painting called Excavation. This is actually a lot of these images are in the Chicago Art Institute. So I'm lucky enough to be in Chicago to be able to see these things on a regular basis whenever I go there. This painting is a real phenomenal painting to see in person. It's pretty big. It's about, I would say maybe, I don't know, 7 feet or so wide. It really takes up most of your space when you're looking at it. When I look at paintings, I'm really looking at not just the image, but how it's made, what the artist was sort of doing in order to create the type of physical presence that's there in the medium itself. And I think that that's super important for artists to think about the how of paintings, how things are actually constructed and made. This painting is a mixture of oil paint and enamel paints. It has this really fantastic sort of churning kind of sense to it. So all of these forms, these sort of cubist based forms are all kind of like undulating and moving around the center. And it's really, it's this very sort of folded sense of space. And it really starts to present itself to you the longer you look at it. Initially, you might just think it's kind of like a jumble and you may not know what's going on, but the more you look at it, the more you see this kind of sense of like folded forms in space, almost like folded paper sort of wrapped on top of itself, sort of, like I said, undulating around like the center. There's all of these little bits and pieces of figures. There's eyeballs and teeth and elbows and knees and all kinds of figuration going on in this, which is really sort of related to cartooning. I grew up drawing comic books when I was younger, so I have a particular affinity for comics and cartooning. De Kooning wanted to be a commercial artist when he moved to America initially. So he was very much a fan of cartooning too. So there's all of this kind of like graphic invention going on in this painting. One of the things about the material, so obviously it's a very painterly painting. When you see it, it's very, the paint is very sort of crusty and thick, and it has a physicality to it. There's these different types of whites that are going on in the painting. So there's this kind of like yellowish white, which I always used to think had just yellowed over time because it was probably like a bad paint that he was using or a cheaper paint. But then there's whites in here that are very cool and very bright. And that to me means probably that yellowish white over most of the space was intentional. And that's actually like a temperature shift that de Kooning was like looking at in order to distinguish it from some of the other parts, like the parts that sort of look like eyes or teeth in the painting. Another thing I want to point out about this painting is de Kooning painted this painting when he was 46 years old. And most people would not even consider this. I mean, it's an important painting in de Kooning's career, but I think most people would not think of this as indicative of sort of like his main style. And that kind of comes right after this. He starts painting his famous women series. And then after that, he goes into his kind of like more abstract landscape and figure paintings that most people think of as like mature de Kooning. So it's just amazing that this is sort of like, he's already 46 years old. And you know, most of the stuff prior to this, most people that are not really into de Kooning or really into art would not even really think about. So like almost half of his life was spent painting paintings that most people wouldn't even think of as de Koonings, which I just think is very interesting, especially in today's art world where, you know, if you're not fully formed by like 30, people think that there's something wrong or something like that. But art careers can be very, very long. It's my next image by Piet Mondrian. I'm picking this particular painting because it has some, actually a lot of these images have kind of like personal, I have sort of like personal histories with them. This painting I copied when I was in college to scale, and I had in my dorm room when I was in college. And up until that point, you know, I was living in Albuquerque in New Mexico, and I'd never seen a Mondrian in person. So I was just copying this from some sort of photograph or kind of some kind of image, and probably a book too. I mean, the internet was not great then, so it's probably from a book. And my copy of this, when I finally saw the original, I was really amazed, thinking back at my copy, how poorly I had copied it. Now, obviously I had got, you know, more or less the colors right, and I got like the shapes where they needed to be. But Mondrian is such a sensitive painter when it comes to his application of paint. And when you see a lot of Mondrians in person, they're very delicately painted, and they look very hard edge, very smooth. You know, you might think like, oh, this is like airbrushed on and taped. But in reality, when you see them in person, they're very, when you get up close to the edges, they're very, you know, he's sort of like freehanding the edges in a lot of places. There's like a diffused quality to some of the edges. And in certain paintings, not in this one so much, although in some of the blacks, there is like a little bit of more of like a paint viscosity to it. But in a lot of his paintings, they have this this very painterly feel. So there's almost like a buildup of the brushstroke. They're not smooth. And to me, it just shows, I mean, that was important to Mondrian. He was, even though he's painting these very geometric abstract paintings, he's still concerned about the surface. He's still concerned about how delicate like the paint application is. And I think that's very important for painters to see. If you just saw this, like I said, in a book or just in an image, you wouldn't know that. You know, you'd be making, like I did, you would be making like a copy in the wrong way. Next image is by Robert Ryman. I've actually never seen this particular painting, but I wanted to point this one out. There's a very nice Ryman painting here in Chicago that's pretty big, and it's kind of one of his squiggle paintings. But this one I really like because of the sort of simplicity of the process. And Ryman is just the king of like of process paintings and doing as much as you can with very limited means. So for the most part, you know, he set this limitation on himself of using primarily just white paint, all these different types of white paint, and his supports, whatever types of supports he was using. Typically they're linen, but they can be anything. They can be cotton. Sometimes they're metal, wood. And he basically sets up these kind of like problems or processes, and then that creates a painting. So he thinks about what this process is going to be, and then he executes that. So getting this amount of creativity out of like limitations is very important to me. And all of these little subtleties in Ryman become very important. So, you know, in this particular painting, he took his linen support, he took a particular type of paint. This is probably oil paint, and whatever it was, a 1-inch, 2-inch brush, and probably put like a single stroke across and then another stroke starting in the middle and then going across from there. And that was the process. And it was basically, what are you going to get once you commit to that process and create a painting that way? And most of Ryman's paintings sort of follow that idea. I love this because I am not a fan of like artists sort of sitting back and waiting for inspiration. I think it's very important to just be doing what you do and making what you make and thinking of ways to just keep you busy. One of the things I hate the most in the studio is if you don't know what you're going to do on a particular day. And I think it's really important to have some kind of system there so that you can get to work and sort of make whatever it is you're making. If anybody has any questions or anything, by the way, feel free to put them in the chat. So this is a painting by Bryce Martin. This is one of his early monochrome paintings. And I love this painting and this series of paintings because this is an example of just probably the ultimate example of a painter just saying and executing a painting as just surface and color. So there's not a lot going on in these paintings as far as like image, obviously, or like sort of like any kind of like linear content or anything like that. It's pretty much just color and just surface, but that can be enough in a painting. If you do surface well enough, it can be enough to hold someone's attention. So in these, he used this beeswax and turpentine and oil medium, and he created these really rich, lush surfaces. Or if you ever see these in person, they have this translucency to them, and they're just so beautiful as surfaces. And he really sort of shows you what's possible if you just focus on just that one aspect, just color and surface of painting, what you can do there. And he's also like always like right on the line of like almost being a little like too pretty, which I always find interesting in art too, just really sort of threading this line of how close can you get to sort of being like too attractive in a painting. There has to be something that's like a little bit of like a dissonance there, and Martin's always sort of like right on that line. There's a really fantastic mini documentary on Bryce Martin from the 60s when he was making these paintings, or 70s when he was making these paintings, and it's just him in his like Soho loft or whatever, and he's painting these paintings, and it's really great. You just get to see him paint. He would brush his color on these canvases, and then he'd take this big spatula and sort of like smooth it down and get this really amazing surface on it. And he just talks about painting in such a wonderful sort of almost like mystical way. And at one point he talks about these paintings as like shields, and he calls them art shields. And I just always really loved that description of them. It's Pierre Bonnard. This painting is actually in the Met in New York. It's a pretty large painting for Bonnard. It's pretty big. I want to say like maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet long, maybe. He is just a master colorist. And I used to not, it took me a while to come around to him, which sometimes happens with artists. Like you may not like somebody at first, and the more you look at them, the more you start to like figure out what it is that they're doing. And that was the case with Bonnard for me. I wasn't sure about the colors. I used to think that they were kind of garish, but the longer I looked at him, the more sort of like his methodology sort of came across to me, and actually like the balance of his sort of these formal elements of color and tonality or value structure became more and more apparent. And all the things he does with spatial distortions and placement of shapes are just amazing. Also, his surface is really amazing. It's sort of this dry brush sort of approach to painting. And he does these little brush strokes with sort of like this dry brushy color. And it really gives the paintings this kind of like glow, and they really like sort of sparkle when you see them in person. It's an interesting color palette. It's a sort of secondary color palette with greens and oranges and violets, just kind of like an odd color palette to use. It's not very typical. Here I have a black and white version of that painting. And I'll do this with paintings. The computer and Photoshop make this so easy, and it's such a wonderful way to sort of analyze sort of value structures in paintings, especially in like high chroma paintings, because typically it's difficult to see these value structures when you have a lot of the color. So typically the color sort of tricks our eyes into thinking that things are actually lighter than they are. When you take that color away, you see the value structure for what it is. Now, a lot of times with these very bright, colorful modernist paintings, that value structure is usually very in the sort of middle ground of a value scale. So you can see like the lightest lights in this image, which would be, around here. Can you see the cursor? I don't know if you can see the cursor. Yeah, which would be around this area, are actually grays. They're actually, relatively dark grays. If I were to take some of those out and put them on the white of the background, they're actually not as light as you think. When I turn the color on, it almost seems like the painting gets lighter. It doesn't actually get lighter. It's just like that color sort of comes in, and we sort of perceive it as lighter. Gerhard Richter painting from his Biedermeinhof group of paintings. Now this is another painting that I have like a particular relationship with, because it was a painting that I encountered in college and undergrad. I used to go to the fine arts library. Again, this is before like the internet really had like a lot of images you could look at. So I would go to the fine arts library and look at all these art books. And I found this kind of like postmodernist art book. I don't remember the title, but I'd never heard of Richter. This would have been like in the late 90s. I'd never heard of him. And I just came upon this image, didn't know who he was. And the image was so kind of moving and powerful that I immediately, it was like teeny tiny on the page. And it was still so striking that I was just thinking like, who is this guy? Like, what is this? And, I started researching him, and just coincidentally, that was around the time that the MoMA did a massive retrospective on Richter. That retrospective actually toured to a few different museums, and I saw it in San Francisco. I actually flew out to San Francisco just to go see that show. That's the first time I ever did that, to go see just like an artist retrospective. And I was just blown away. It was very influential to me. I immediately, tried to learn as much as I could about Richter and his practice. This painting is based on a photograph of this German terrorist, essentially, that was killed. And, Richter sort of copied the photograph. He might have cropped it a little bit. And then in his copy, he used this sort of blur technique, which was this method of painting that he would do. So it's kind of related to photography, but it's also just this great invention or method of making these kind of realist paintings, particularly like photo-based realist paintings, to give them kind of like atmosphere and interest, visual interest. And it's such a great invention. I'm amazed that somebody didn't like sort of discover this before. And it's kind of like his thing now. People can't really do it to this to the same degree that he does it. But I was just amazed at this method that he had sort of like, I don't know, kind of sort of like stumbled upon or sort of discovered. And you know, I still love Richter so much. I mean, he's a very serious painter. We go back in time a little bit. This is a painting by Cezanne. And I picked this painting because I wanted to talk a little bit about painting's use of space. So we just looked at Gerhard Richter, and this is obviously a photo-based painting, which means that the space in the painting is very photographic. And we're so used to photographic pictures that we just sort of take it for granted as to like what photo space is. But painting space tends to be sort of different because you can do things in paintings that you can't really do in any other type of media. I mean, you can sort of do it now in digital media because digital media has become a kind of another method of drawing or painting, really. But in typical photography, a lot of these, unless you were doing collage, a lot of the spatial distortions that you can put into an image are kind of only possible in painting. And here you can see Cezanne sort of taking advantage of that. So he has all kinds of different ways that he's sort of pushing the space around. And again, this is one of those situations where if you're just looking at this image for not very long, you might just see like some fruit and a table and a plant. But in reality, there's all kinds of really interesting spatial experiences going on. And that's really the subject matter in this painting and in a lot of Cezanne's work, is how we perceive that sense of space. So he's doing all of these very subtle things. You know, he'll put darker tones behind objects like these leaves, and that sort of like creates this kind of like spatial pocket behind the leaves. It sort of sucks them in a little bit. He'll do things like have different perspectives on something like this table, and then he obscures it with this this cloth, which is kind of interesting. So if you were to take this cloth away, this table would be almost like broken in a way. You're looking sort of down on it over here, and it sort of pops up over here. It doesn't really connect correctly back here, so this edge sort of ends right here, and then it pops back up over here. So all of those things sort of change the space in here, and it creates this kind of spatial tension where this plant and this fruit, everything is kind of like moving towards the center of the canvas. It's sort of like rolling towards the middle. And that's because Cezanne is actually creating that kind of spatial tension. You can see it over here too on the edge of the table. Again, he puts this sort of darker tone back here, and that sort of like clamps down on that form and sort of pushes it over. And he's just such a master at that, sort of manipulating space in that way. Oops. So here we have Giorgio Morandi, who was very influenced by Cezanne. And he does a lot of the same kind of things as Cezanne does. One thing I wanted to point out in this image was this this cup in the middle right, because you know, where is that cup? Is it in the background? Is it floating? It's very difficult to say. It's a very interesting kind of placement for that cup. If we were using traditional perspective, it kind of doesn't make any sense where it is. But Morandi knows that you don't, that type of optical perspective, like you don't really have to do that in painting. You can manipulate space in all kinds of different ways. He does the same thing as Cezanne here, putting these sort of darker outlines, creating these sort of pockets behind his behind his objects and forms, and it sort of like makes them pop out a little bit. It also gives them like this sense of relief behind them, and again, creating all of this spatial tension, like here, this kind of like knife sort of edge right there. And then I really love this little red sliver of whatever it is in the back. Draws your eye here. It's definitely the warmest color in this image. And it's interesting because, again, if you look at this image in black and white, it totally disappears. It just becomes part of the background. And you go from essentially these 4 forms in the foreground to 3 forms in the foreground if you get rid of that color. And what that does is, because it's the same value as the ground, when you see it in the color image, it kind of creates this sense of like ambiguity as to sort of where that is. Anytime you have colors that are very close in value sort of next to each other, it kind of like tricks our brain into thinking like, I don't really know what's going on spatially there. I don't really know where those things are. And it creates this kind of visual hum or vibration that is very like enticing to look at. He's also like a master of differences in paint viscosity. You can see that in the background. He uses these sort of semi-transparent types of paints that still have a lot of body to them. And it's a very interesting sort of effect that I really love, where he has this sort of toned ground. He puts this darker color on top, and you sort of get, you get 2 colors because you can see the toned ground peeking through. So wherever it mixes, you can see the toned ground, you can see the color he's putting on top, and then sometimes like where it's like sort of half and half. And that's kind of like an old master trick of sort of activating a space. So this is Wayne Tebow. Tebow was very influenced by Randy. And actually, when he first started doing his famous kind of cake and dessert paintings, he just stole Morandi compositions, like literally just stole them, and changed the objects, but stole a lot of his compositions. And I think that's very important, especially for young painters, young artists, to understand is, you can take stuff from wherever. You shouldn't feel bad about that. Chances are you're never going to do anything so close to the person that you're taking something from that it's going to ever be like even noticeable, really. But I think it's important that if something kind of like turns you on in a painting, you need to act upon that and sort of use that somehow, or at least use it as like an impetus to do something or to lead you somewhere. And for Tebow, Morandi was kind of like, it sort of set him free a little bit from some of the things he'd been doing earlier. Tebow's such a good painter as far as like paint handling and sort of the viscosity of his paint. The other amazing thing is like these paintings they're not done from life. Tebow was another trained illustrator and cartoonist, and he would just make these up. All of these compositions are just made up. So he wasn't looking at 3 donuts when he painted this. He just knew how these forms, how to render these forms, and he would just create them just as he painted, which I think is very interesting and can lead to really good paintings. So the painter Maureen Glace, she paints these sort of small landscapes. Usually they have some sort of like building or structure in them. They're very simple looking, but they are not simple. They're very complex paintings. She tends to, sometimes she works from photographs, and the paintings kind of either work or they don't, and then she'll destroy them if they don't work, and or try different versions. And I really love this particular painting because it works so well with these buildings working against the sort of natural world, the trees and the snow and the sky. Having these like very warm red tones pop out against this very cool background. It's just such an interesting pictorial thing that she's doing. And this is another one where if you go to the black and white version, it totally changes that sense of those red warm colors advancing. They really pop out. She really gets a nice sense of space, especially like right around here as you sort of like go around this building towards the back, towards the smaller building in the back. And that disappears a little bit. It becomes a little bit flatter here when you don't have those warm colors popping out. This is Albert Pinkham Ryder. I just wanted to talk a little bit about him because for me, he is such a great compositionalist. He really boils things down to their essence, really distills things, as far as like the tonal structure and the shape sort of structure in his paintings. Here we have this little like death figure on a horse, and we have this little snake down here. And that leads me to this other painter that I really admire, Albert York. And I wanted to point out these two paintings because York was inspired a lot by Ryder and even used some of his same kind of images like this skeleton or death figure. In a lot of York's paintings, he'll use this snake, the same sort of snake figure or form. So York will use those in his paintings often, and then also just that simplicity. And York has talked about Ryder and seeing Ryder's paintings in shows and how striking they were and how they sort of blew off like a lot of the other paintings on the wall. And, for him, wanting to get that kind of like distilled image was something that was really important. So he was heavily inspired by Ryder to make his own paintings. Another painter that was important to York and to me is Manet. And this particular painting is also in the Art Institute. So again, I'm lucky enough to get to see this pretty often. It's very thickly painted, as a lot of Manets are from around this period. And I love that sort of like painterly feel. It's also very sort of graphic and simplified, which is another thing I really enjoy about Manet, and I use in my own work. It's also very funny. It's a very quirky and funny image. It's got all these mouths. This fish, this dead fish, has its mouth open. This pot has its mouth open. These oysters over here sort of have their mouths open. So there's just like this kind of, I always think of it as like cartoons or Muppets or something like that, having this like sort of personality to these forms. It's actually a pretty large painting too. It's probably like maybe like 3 feet or so wide. For a still life, it's pretty big. Manet was like really important to me also when I was younger, even before I went to college and decided I wanted to become a painter. I copied a lot of Manet paintings in charcoal when I was in high school. For some reason, I was just really drawn to them, and I've loved Manet ever since. He's a painter that I always think pushes paintings as far as they can go, and sometimes he doesn't necessarily get like the most pretty painting, but I think that pushing paintings that far is very important to do. So next up are my paintings. So going from all these like really fantastic painters to me, it's abrupt. So for the past few years, I've been doing these very small landscape paintings primarily. Typically, they are about 12-inch square. When I was in New York, when I was living in New York, I was doing paintings that were a little bit bigger. But this size, when I moved to Chicago, my wife and I had just had our first daughter. I didn't have that much space initially when I lived in Chicago, and I decided to downsize a lot of my paintings. which I've been wanting to do anyway. When I was in New York, I wanted to paint small. It's sort of like um, what I enjoy most in painting, is sort of these small easel-sized paintings. A lot of the paintings I admire are also this sort of scale. But in New York, it's like everybody makes big paintings, and there is like this kind of like peer pressure to do that. And I didn't make gigantic paintings, but I made maybe paintings that were like slightly bigger than I should have been making. So when I moved to Chicago, I didn't feel that pressure as much anymore, and I had this space limitation. So I decided to sort of shrink the paintings to the size that I wanted. Now, when I was in high school, I was really into comic book drawing, and I think a lot of this comes from that, doing these sort of small drawings when I was younger. So these landscapes are sort of inspired by the kind of Chicago landscape that I see most of the time here, but they're also sort of memory based. They're not like literal or like accurate in some kind of optical way of like super particular places. They're more of like paintings of like my memory or like impression of some of these places that I sort of see and inhabit where I live. And again, I try to do, a lot of times I'll do multiple versions of these paintings, like similar to Ryman, sort of just trying to keep myself busy. So I might take like a painting like this and do 2 or 3 different versions where I'm sort of using the composition, and maybe I change the color or the value structures or the paint handling in order to see some other variation I could get out of the painting. And they can sort of generate other paintings. De Kooning used to do this with his paintings too. He would sort of have like his drawings and his sort of unfinished paintings, and he would use those, he would transfer them to canvases multiple times, and then he would sort of do variations on those. And he called it, like, he wanted his painting practice to be like a yogurt. So it's like you can take a yogurt culture and you can put it in some other in milk, and you can make more yogurt. And I always really liked that analogy of being able to take something and it can sort of generate or create other things from it. This is a detail. You can sort of see some of the paint handling. Typically, my paintings have like a pretty pronounced it's kind of like surface and tactility to the paint. They're not very thin. They're kind of thickly painted. I did this series of trees that I was sort of thinking of as the trees being these kind of negative spaces, sort of taking up most of the image. So these kind of like sort of like holes of negative space, sort of absorbing most of like what the viewer is looking at, so that you have this kind of like this like spatial tension going on just on the edges of the painting, kind of like just holding that like big negative space there. Again, I would do different versions. So this painting and this painting are related. The forms are similar. They're just different, different color and value structures, and changing little things like sort of these cloud forms in the back, kind of trying to balance this giant negative kind of space form with this little sort of dagger of like the sky up in the right-hand corner. I like this tree. This reminded me of some sort of like, I don't know, like a tree, but it's also kind of like smoke, and it's kind of ominous in a way. Just this sort of like, sort of smoky monster tree in front of this the lake here. Just like an eerie feeling that I liked. Typically, I like to think of my forms. They're the things that I paint as having some kind of like personality or like relationship to each other. I tend to anthropomorphize them and like think about them as with like emotional states or sort of interacting with each other. I have these kind of trees sort of next to each other, but they're kind of like repulsed by one another, trying to get away from each other. And I like to think about, I often do kind of compositionally, I will often think about things in that way. sort of giving forms personalities, and that sort of determines where they're going to be, or what types of little spatial anomalies I have like around them. This tree, this was just actually, it's still up. This is in the show that's up right now at BSF in Los Angeles. So this is just this little like funny tree sort of having this conversation with this little this cloud up in the right hand side. So I like to have this, again, like having this sort of personality kind of like relationship between these things, or these conversations between forms in a way. And this sort of motif sort of has been popping up a lot. These sort of like small clouds acting as like, I don't know, like punctuation, or again, they're having like sort of conversations with like the larger forms. This is also a painting from BSF. Again, with this little cloud form up in the left-hand corner. And then this one I liked because I felt like these trees were sort of like falling off of this hill, and that cloud was sort of like trying to keep them up, keep them from falling out of the painting. I think that's it, actually. That was my time.
Beautiful. Oh my God. Thank you. What a wonderful talk. I really, really loved hearing about your inspirations and how you study the paintings. I've never heard someone speak about paintings like that before. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
And how it inspires you and how you transfer that to your work.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to, I really like thinking about painting as, sort of like some kind of practical thing. There's a famous quote by Lucian Freud where he said, he would go to the National Gallery almost like somebody would go to see a doctor. So there'd be something like wrong with his painting, and he would go to the National Gallery to try to, look at, whoever he's looking at, in order to Titian or whoever, in order to try to get some sort of like diagnosis for like what's wrong with his painting.
Oh, wow. Those are great.
Yeah.
So I really, I wanted to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat for us. Do you want to stop sharing, Will?
Yeah, let me.
So I was going to ask you, let me see. Somebody's saying wonderful talk. Oh, thank you, Dustin, for the intro. That was from Pip. Thank you, Pip, for joining us. Hi, thank you everyone for joining us. I thought your talk about creativity was really interesting, because I always think as a curator, how do people keep coming up with these fresh ideas? Because I always think everything's taken, like you're saying, it is, but we're stealing from other people and making it our own. But you're right. Do you want to talk about how you talk about to your students about creativity, or what do you, when you're stuck, what do you do? What's your system? You say you have a system sometimes in your practice.
Yeah, sometimes, like, for my own paintings, if I'm in the studio and I have a block of time and I'm going to use it, and I don't really like have something specific in mind that I really want to do, I'll do something like just make another version of an existing painting and see what happens with that. I just don't want to be sort of like fussing around, like worrying about, something like, what is the new thing that I'm going to do? It doesn't have to be so thought out. It can just be, just something simple like, oh, I'm going to do another version of this thing. And then that might take you somewhere else. But also, sometimes it really is just like, oh, I just saw this El Greco show at the Art Institute, and I loved the way he used clouds, and I'm going to like take that and try to like see what I can do with that. That doesn't mean necessarily like, oh, I'm going to take this specific painting and just copy it or anything. It's just sort of like, it might be a method that I'm sort of observing that he did, or like a way that he used the paint, for example, like, oh, like this, it seemed like it was like this viscosity or like stickiness, or his sort of like color is this, and then I will use that. Typically, like, it just sort of leads you into new, interesting places. And I always think that that's the best thing about, for me, about like looking at other artists, is I get most inspired by looking at other painters. And the thing that makes me want to paint most of the time is looking at other painters. It's not usually like, oh, I'm out on a walk and I see like a tree and I'm like, I got to paint that tree. Like, that rarely happens for me. It's usually, I'm flipping through an art book and I find something, or I'm at a museum and I find something, or I'm at a gallery and I find something, or I'm talking to Dustin and he mentions something.
It sounds like you go to galleries and museums a lot.
Yeah,
That's part
I
of your
do.
practice, is visiting other, yeah.
I think that's super, super important for, especially for younger artists, is to really try to see real artwork in person. And so much of, I mean, the internet is great now. You can find, I mean, I find images all the time that I've never seen by artists I love, and that's great. Same thing with like social media. Um, but I also feel like, I've had enough experience to know when I'm looking at a digital image of We Art painting or something, I know more or less how to read that thing. So I know, like, I know more or less what it would look like in person. Like, it would be this thick, it would be this transparent, those types of things. If you don't have that experience in person, you're probably not going to be able to read digital images sort of correctly, right? And like, that's what I did with the Mondrian painting. I didn't realize like the sort of surface qualities that he had in his paintings when I copied it. So, that copy was like, no, just not the best type of copy. So, uh, I grew up in New Mexico. I went to college there. I didn't leave there until I was, mid-20s, when I went to graduate school. And really, it was when I got to the East Coast that I was able to see a lot more art in person. And up until that point, I was having to make these sort of like treks to LA or to Las Vegas or wherever, Denver or whatever I could go to go see real painting. And I think it's, especially if you're in some sort of like large city where you have a good museum, where you have galleries, it's so important to get out and like look at things and know what things look like in person. Um,
No, I
because
agree. Yeah, I like your story where you went to San Francisco to see the retrospective. I thought that was great. I'm glad to hear that I'm not the only nerd that does things like that. So I love to do that. I have a couple comments and questions. So one is, I love the negative space concept of your trees. Your palette is more similar to York and Morandi than, say, Galas. Has your palette always been soft? And what mediums do you use?
um, my palette's changed a lot in the last like 5 years or so. And I have been working in this sort of like tighter kind of value space, um, which again, like, that to me is just something that I'm kind of interested in right now. And I'm just trying to see how many different places I can sort of take it, really. It could change in the future, I guess. Uh, Mediums, that was the other part of that.
Yes.
I use like mediums can be any, for me, I've kind of simplified my medium a lot over the years. There's like a million different things you can use if you buy them. I use a marble dust medium that I make myself. Um, and basically, pretty much I stick mostly just like linseed oil and this marble dust medium. An important thing in painting is paint sort of rheology and viscosity. And if you're just buying tube paints, that's fine. Like, people can paint with tube paints. Plenty of people do. It's fine. But if you look at sort of the history of painting, um, the quality of like tube oil paints is kind of like a recent thing. It's a recent development. That sort of like buttery kind of paint that comes out of a tube is not the same type of paint that would have been used like, I don't know, 150 years ago. That's not saying that one is better than the other. They're just different. So changing the stickiness of paint can be really important depending on what type of effects you want to get in your painting. So, you know, for some painters that's not important, but for other painters it's very important. And you know, I mentioned Ryman. Like Ryman uses all these different types of paints. He'll use acrylic paint, he'll use enamel paints, he'll use all these different brands of oil paints, and he knows that like they all have different viscosities, different qualities to them. So if he takes a brush and he gets this particular white and he drags it along this type of linen, he knows like this is going to be a different effect. So, you know, mediums I think are important in as much as they get you the effect that you want. If there's some kind of effect that you really want, then you should do everything you can to find the medium that meets that effect, you know. But I don't think there's like magical formulas that like are just going to give you a great painting or anything like that. It just, you know, sometimes you know what you want and you just sort of try to figure it out and you get to it. Sometimes you don't know what you want and you just play around and you just sort of stumble across something and you're like, oh, this is great. Like, I'm going to use this for a while. Or sometimes you're like Ryman and he's just like, there's all these things available. I'm going to try them all and see like what I can get out of each one, you know.
And that goes to your practice of just, if you don't have something, just try something, a different medium, or, you know, experiment on the same type of subject matter.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I don't think that you can get like a good painting out of like anything really, if you're being sort of creative enough. You know, you don't need the best materials, you don't need every single color, you don't any of that stuff. Like none of that stuff matters. You just have to like sort of know the limitations and know what to do that's like sort of interesting within those limitations. I think that's really important, you know.
Wonderful. I have time for one more question, and one person is asking, what are you working on now? And do you do painting? So it's really two questions. And do you have paintings of other weather conditions or anything, or what are you working on right now?
Right now, you can sort of see them behind me. Like right now, I'm doing these kind of like tree paintings. I mean, they're similar to the ones that I showed you. I'm doing multiple versions. I'm going to have some work up at my Chicago gallery. Ackerman Clark is going to show some stuff at NADA in New York in May. So I'm kind of working. I have a lot of those paintings done, but I'm trying to finish them up, and they're kind of like a series based. So when was it? Maybe like a year or two ago. Was it before the pandemic? It might have been during the pandemic. Anyway, there was a big Monet show at the Art Institute. And at this Monet show, they had, I mean, the Art Institute has a lot of like really great Monets, but this show sort of spanned his whole career. And there were a lot of his sort of serial images. So typically, you know, you might think of his haystack paintings as, or his like Houses of Parliament paintings as like his serial paintings, but they had some other sort of landscape ones. And it was just interesting to me, like Monet would just, he would just take the same image and he would just copy it, you know, the composition, and then he would paint it with a new type of like light or a new type of like color experience sort of in it. And he would get, you know, he would get this different type of light and space depending on like what he chose to do. And I just really loved seeing that and seeing that sort of like the possibilities there. You know, Monet painted most of those paintings in his studio. He wasn't really painting en plein air or anything like that. So those are like, he's making that up. He's making up that like sort of color world in his studio. And I wanted to play around with that in some paintings. So I'm doing that with a few, with this show, and then like with a few of my paintings. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. I have an amazing idea that the paintings speak to an artist and his paintings speak back. So I have that comment from Peggy. Hi, Peggy. But Thank you, Will. It was so great to meet you and hear about your practice. Thank everyone for joining us this evening. It was good to see all of you. And if you're ever in Miami, we'd love to meet you in person, face to face. So thank you again, and everyone be well. Take care.
Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Bye-bye.